She murdered her newborn daughter, then framed another woman for the crime. But this was just the beginning. Most people have never heard of Empress Wu Zetian. But in 7th century China, she rose from concubine to become the only female emperor in the country's history, and perhaps the most ruthless ruler the world has ever seen. Forget Caligula, forget Ivan the Terrible. Wu made them look like amateurs. She didn't seize power overnight. Her story began with silence, shadows, and a plan so cold-blooded it still chills the bones of historians. Wu entered the imperial palace at 14, one of many nameless girls in service to Emperor Taizong. When he died, palace rules demanded she live the rest of her life in a Buddhist convent. She had other ideas. Instead, she seduced the new emperor, Taizong's son, Gaozong, and returned to court not as a servant, but as his lover. But there was a problem. Gaozong already had a wife, Empress Wang, and a beloved concubine, consort Xiao. So Wu got pregnant. Shortly after giving birth to a daughter, the child was found dead in her crib. Wu's reaction was flawless. Tears, shaking, whispered accusations. She blamed Empress Wang. No one questioned it, not when Wu played the grieving mother so perfectly. Gaozong, overwhelmed and already under her spell, believed every word. But Wu didn't stop there. Over the next months, she poisoned Gaozong against both women, with forged letters, rumors, and staged evidence. Wang and Xiao were arrested. Wu personally oversaw their punishment. Their hands and feet were severed. They were dumped into wine vats and drowned slowly, screaming. One of them, it said, cursed Wu with her final breath, swearing to return as a cat and haunt her forever. Wu was so shaken she banned cats from the palace for the rest of her life. By 655 AD, she was empress, and the empire was only beginning to bleed. Once empress, Wu Zetian wasted no time turning power into absolute control. She didn't just eliminate enemies. She studied their pain, treated torture like an evolving science, and transformed fear into governance. What followed was not chaos, but design. Calculated, deliberate, merciless. Wu began building her empire of terror from the inside out. First, she installed her own loyalists at every level of the imperial court, officials with no past, no name, only allegiance to her. Then she created a private intelligence force, spies, informants, and secret police handpicked for their cruelty. Their mission was simple: find disloyalty, or invent it. But fear alone wasn't enough. Wu needed something unforgettable, something that would make betrayal feel like a death sentence before the axe ever fell. So she started to innovate. One of her most infamous punishments was called human swine. It started with amputation: hands, feet, ears, eyes, tongue removed. The victim was then thrown into a filthy pen to crawl and rot until infection took over. Some lasted days. Wu watched them herself, smiling, silent. Another method involved massive bronze cauldrons filled with water. Prisoners were stripped and dropped inside. Fires were lit slowly beneath. It was boiling alive, stretched over hours. Wu would often dine while watching. For her, the screams were background music. Then came the reverse hanging. Victims suspended upside down, blood flooding their skulls until vessels burst and brains hemorrhaged. She tested durations, adjusted positions. She recorded the results. Children, women, generals, each body gave her new data. Wu didn't just punish enemies. She visited them, personally, walked the corridors of her private dungeons, whispered into the ears of prisoners as they begged for mercy, then nodded to her guards, instructing them on exactly how slow the suffering should be. She used these methods not just on rebels or assassins, but on rivals long defeated. Empress Wang, consort Xiao, Even after their mutilation and imprisonment, Wu wanted more. She wanted them to feel every hour of her rule as agony, and she made sure they did. These were not random acts of madness. This was a system, a performance, and it worked. Because while people whispered her name with horror, no one dared say it out loud. By the late 660s, Wu Zetian had perfected her most terrifying invention, the state of permanent suspicion. It wasn't enough to silence her enemies. She made the entire Tang Empire paranoid. And for that, she needed something more than guards or dungeons. She needed surveillance, so she created the most advanced secret police system the ancient world had ever seen. They were called the Cruel Officials, men trained not only to extract information, but to destroy lives with precision. Wu gave them limitless authority. They could arrest anyone at any time for any reason or for no reason at all. All that was needed was a note. Across the empire, Wu installed bronze boxes in public squares and marketplaces, anonymous accusation drop-offs. Anyone could accuse anyone, husbands, wives, children, servants, no evidence required. One slip of paper could mean torture or death. But Wu didn't trust even her own spies. So she built layers of intelligence, rival groups of informants spying on each other. Loyalty was never assumed. It was constantly tested. Even the secret police feared the secret police. The result was total silence. At court, nobles stopped speaking in full sentences. Advisors whispered. Ministers aged in months. Some refused to sleep indoors, afraid the walls might hide ears. Others faked illness just to avoid an audience with the Empress. Wu used it all. When she wanted a minister gone, she didn't need proof. Her agents planted it. Documents forged, witnesses coerced, confessions tortured into existence. Trials were a formality. Outcomes were predetermined. Lai Yunqian, her most brutal enforcer, became legend in his own right. He invented the 10 tortures, including vinegar throats, scalding liquid forced down victims' gullets until their inner tissue dissolved, and the donkey cult, victims tied in contorted positions until their joints cracked one by one. Even Lai wasn't safe. When Wu sensed his ambition growing, she had him arrested, tortured, and executed, quietly, without explanation. Just another whisper gone. That was her genius. Everyone was watched, everyone was vulnerable, and no one, not even her loyal monsters, ever felt safe. Wu's cruelty didn't stop with spies or cells. When she wanted someone truly erased, she fed them to animals. Not metaphorically, literally. Her palace became a stage for executions that bordered on theater, complete with an audience, wine, and the slow ritualistic destruction of the condemned. She built a private menagerie, a twisted zoo of starved beasts trained not for spectacle, but for violence. Tigers, wolves, feral dogs, and bears, all kept in iron-barred pits just below her viewing platform. Their purpose was clear: to devour traitors. But Wu refined even this into something darker. Each animal had a designated role. Tigers were reserved for nobles and officials who betrayed her directly. A royal death for royal treason, she once said. Wolves were used for conspirators, the pack tearing apart those who plotted in secret. Dogs were saved for family, anyone related to Wu by blood who dared cross her. But death wasn't fast. Wu designed what she called progressive feeding. The beasts were trained to wound, not kill, at least not immediately. Bears would swipe and maim, ripping flesh without going for the throat. Tigers would pin and bite, licking blood from gashes to prolong suffering. The dogs, they started at the feet, always the feet, chewing upwards while the victim screamed. Wu didn't look away. She hosted these executions like banquets, silk-robed officials seated beside her, music playing, Platters of roasted duck and steamed buns passed around, while just below men and women were torn to pieces. She even kept a ledger: names, dates, crimes, but also the animal used, the method, the duration of suffering. Notes written in her own hand: survived 17 minutes before losing consciousness. Repeat technique with next traitor. This was control through terror at its most refined. No walls could protect, no bloodline could shield, no silence could save, and the empire watched. Behind the spectacle of blood and teeth, Zetian ruled with surgical precision. She wasn't simply a sadist, she was a strategist. Every act of cruelty served a purpose: to tighten her grip on power and reshape the empire in her image. Once her enemies were purged, Wu set her sights on legitimacy. As Empress, she still ruled beside Gaozong, but after he suffered a stroke, she effectively became the one making all decisions. Ministers bowed to her. Edicts were issued in her name. She sat behind the screen during court meetings, a veil of silk between her and her male officials who dared not meet her eyes. She abolished the illusion of shared rule after Gaozong's death. Instead of stepping aside for her son, as tradition demanded, she declared herself the true ruler. Not Empress Dowager, not Regent, Emperor. The first and only woman in Chinese history to claim that title outright. It was more than symbolic. She founded a new dynasty, the Zhou, discarding the Tang name altogether. Coins were reminted with her likeness. Statues of the Buddha were recarved to resemble her face. She even ordered the construction of a massive stele in the Qianling Mausoleum, deliberately left blank, a symbol, she said, that her achievements defied description. And in many ways, she wasn't wrong. Despite her brutality, Wu was astonishingly effective. Roads were built, taxes restructured, corruption punished, unless it came from loyalty. She promoted capable administrators regardless of birth or class. Some were former peasants, others women. She didn't just want obedience, she wanted efficiency. But her reforms came at a price: absolute control. To serve in her government was to live under constant surveillance. To succeed was to live in fear of drawing her attention. One wrong word, one misinterpreted silence, and the animals would be waiting. And yet the empire endured. Some would even say it prospered. The question wasn't whether Wu ruled well. It was, could anyone survive ruling like this forever? As Wu's reign stretched into its second decade, her empire became a palace of mirrors, every corridor reflecting power, fear, and betrayal. Trust had no place here. Even her own family was not spared. In fact, they were among the first to fall. She had sons, but none were safe. Her eldest, the natural heir, questioned her authority once, only once, and was immediately demoted, exiled, and later found dead under mysterious circumstances. Poisoned, some whispered. Ordered, others swore. Wu said nothing. Her other sons fared no better. One was accused of plotting rebellion and died before his trial. Another, after showing signs of independence, was quietly imprisoned. Wu didn't tolerate potential rivals, even those who called her mother. But she wasn't alone. Her inner circle now included figures even more feared than the ministers. The most notorious was Shangguan Wan-er, Wu's secretary, speechwriter, and enforcer. A woman educated in literature and law, yet trained in manipulation and silence. Wana had once been the granddaughter of a family Wu personally destroyed. Now she served the woman who had orchestrated their deaths, loyally, brilliantly. Together they constructed a political machine built on elegance and execution. Documents were crafted with perfect language, each line hiding blades. Trials were wrapped in ceremony, each verdict predetermined. Wu didn't need to raise her voice. Her court spoke in whispers and died in silence, and still she watched everything. She commissioned statues with eyes wide open, mirrors in hallways that didn't reflect truth but watched for treason. Servants were rotated constantly, food was sampled, letters opened, guests questioned before being allowed into her presence. Even the guards who patrolled her residence were switched out weekly, to avoid familiarity, to keep them guessing, to ensure loyalty stayed sharp. The effect was suffocating, yet no one dared leave. Because despite the terror, Wu's court was also the center of influence, power, and wealth. To serve her meant prestige, to displease her meant annihilation. It was a kingdom of brilliance balanced on a knife's edge, and the blade never dulled. As Wu's rule tightened, she turned increasingly to omens, prophecy, and divine justification. It wasn't enough to command by force, she wanted history itself to crown her. So she rewrote it. She began by aligning herself with Buddhist doctrine, commissioning texts that portrayed her as the reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha. Temples were ordered to preach her divine right to rule. Statues were altered to reflect her likeness. Even sacred sutras were revised, subtly transforming her image from ruler to savior. This spiritual campaign was not just for the people, it was for the bureaucracy. It gave the scholars and ministers who had once murmured against her ascension a framework to rationalize it. She wasn't just a woman who seized power, she was heaven's chosen. And yet, behind the gold-leafed scrolls and incense smoke, the machinery of paranoia continued. One year, a comet passed over Chang'an, a classic omen of unrest. Wu's astrologers were summoned immediately. None dared speak of rebellion. Instead, they praised the comet as a sign of divine transformation. She rewarded them with titles. One who hesitated disappeared within a week. Even language bowed to her. She invented new characters for emperor, ones that fused masculine and feminine components, an official linguistic reshaping of gendered rule. Court scribes had to relearn their trade. Mistakes in documents became grounds for suspicion. But the truth was beginning to crack through. The years had worn her body. Her once commanding presence became thin, veiled, and increasingly absent. Rumors swirled that she trusted talismans more than advisors, that she kept sorcerers in her private chambers, that she spoke to shadows no one else could see. And still, no one moved against her. The fear remained too deep. The memory of what happened to the disloyal was etched into the walls of her court. Ministers still bowed lower than necessary. Generals still averted their eyes. Servants still stepped back into corners as she passed, as if the air itself bent away from her. But even the longest reign, even the darkest, casts a final shadow. And it was getting closer. By the time Wu Zetian reached her 80s, the world she had forged began to slip from her grasp. Age did not humble her. It made her more watchful, more guarded, but no less brutal. Yet the cracks were widening, even within the fortress she'd built from fear. Her health declined, and with it, her tolerance for uncertainty. Whispers began to circle, not of open revolt, but of succession. Who would take her place? Who would dare? She had once executed sons for disobedience. Now, the very idea of choosing an heir left her cornered. Ministers pushed for her to name a successor. She delayed, stalled, refused. The power she had clawed into her hands would not be released easily. In her inner chambers, only a small handful remained truly close to her. Eunuchs, handmaidens, her secretary Vanna. These were no longer political operators, but gatekeepers. They controlled access to the Empress, and through that control, they began seizing power for themselves. One of the most ambitious was a pair of young men, Zhang Yizhi and Zhang Changzong, brothers, charming, beautiful, and calculating. Wu favored them, Some called them lovers, others called them poison. Both might have been right. They massaged her ego, flattered her legend, and insulated her from the outside world. In return, they were given titles, power, and unchecked authority. Officials began to fear them as much as they feared Wu, some even more. That fear created enemies. Within court, resentment festered. High-ranking ministers, once silent, began to plot, carefully, quietly. They didn't need to assassinate Wu. Time was already doing that. But the Zhang brothers, they could be removed. And so in 705, as Wu lay bedridden, barely able to speak, a coalition of generals and ministers struck. The palace was stormed. The Zhang brothers were dragged from Wu's chambers and executed on the spot. Blood on silk, screams behind golden doors. She was too weak to stop it. When dawn broke, Wu Zetian, the Empress, the tyrant, the shadow behind the throne, was no longer ruler of China. She had been dethroned without a war, without a final battle, just a closed door and silence. After 5 decades of manipulation, blood, and absolute control, Wu Zetian's fall came with almost no resistance. The woman who had engineered empires was too frail to fight. Her own machinery of power, the courts, the ministers, the guards, turned without her command. She was forced to abdicate. The Tang dynasty, which she had cast aside years earlier, was hastily restored. Her son, Zhongzong, was placed back on the throne, a puppet for the ministers who orchestrated the coup. The official story was swift and sanitized. The Empress had stepped down peacefully in the name of stability. But behind closed doors, the truth was uglier. Wu was moved to a secondary palace, surrounded not by loyal guards but silent watchers. She was stripped of her titles, her robes, her formal name. In her final days, she lived not as a ruler, but as a memory. Watched, ignored, and finally forgotten by those who owed her everything. Still, she did not beg. She did not plead. She accepted her exile with the same iron stillness that had once terrified a continent. No visitors, no final speeches, no public confessions. Just silence. It is said that she asked for one thing before her death, that her tombstone remain blank. No name, no praise, no condemnation. Just a stone standing in the Valley of Emperors, unmarked. Some believe it was an act of humility. Others say it was the final flex, a ruler so far beyond judgment that even history couldn't speak for her. She died in December of 705, no riots, no mourning procession. The Tang court moved on quickly, eager to erase her shadow. Her reforms were rolled back, her policies rewritten, her statues removed. But her absence lingered in every corner of the empire she'd reshaped. Because no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't deny the truth. The most terrifying, effective, and unforgettable emperor China had ever known was a woman. Centuries have passed, but the legacy of Wu Zetian refuses to fade. Historians still argue over her name: tyrant, visionary, monster, genius. To some, she was a cautionary tale, a woman who clawed her way to power through blood and manipulation, ruling through cruelty unmatched by any emperor before or after. To others, she was a master strategist who shattered 1,000 years of patriarchy, held a divided empire together, and governed with unmatched precision. What's certain is this: she rewrote the rules. Wu didn't inherit power. She took it from emperors, ministers, and even her own family. And she held it, not through birthright or blessing, but through fear, intellect, and brutal efficiency. No one before her dared to imagine a woman sitting on the dragon throne. She made it real. Then dared anyone to challenge her. Her cruelty was not madness, it was policy. Her paranoia wasn't weakness, it was survival. Every horror she unleashed was part of a system, a design. And yet, alongside that terror, she rebuilt roads, expanded education, opened positions of influence to commoners and women, and stabilized a collapsing empire. She was not kind, she was not just, but she was undeniable. Even in death, she broke convention. The stele outside her tomb still stands blank, a slab of stone without inscription, without legacy, without apology. Perhaps she believed her life spoke louder than any carved words, or perhaps she knew the truth. No empire, no dynasty, no history book could contain her. In the end, Wu Zetian did what emperors feared and what historians still struggle to name. She ruled not as a woman, but as power itself. And power, as she proved, does not ask permission. It takes. It survives. It remembers.